Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments in downtown Washington, D.C. To talk to Tim Walton and Adam Lemon, both part of the research team here, and two of the four-person team who produced this great report, Leveling the Playing Field, Reintroducing U.S. Theater Range Missiles in a Post-INF World. The other authors are Jacob Cohn, who has since left CSBA to go to Northrop Grumman, and Toshi Yoshihara as well. Tim, let's start with you. Obviously, today is the formal U.S. departure from the INF, the administration getting some criticism about its decision to leave the INF. But the grounds are, and I think all of our European allies agree as well, that Russia has been violating the INF and doesn't look like it was going to re-enter compliance. And at the same time, this agreement, like all American strategic nuclear reduction agreements, were all focused on the Soviet Union and on Russia and not on China, allowing China actually to accelerate development of this class of weapons. Let's just start, what do you think of the administration's justification to get out of the treaty?
Thank you very much for having us on, Vago. I think it was the right decision. The INF Treaty was an excellent treaty that served the U.S. well for more than 30 years. After signing it in 1987, the Soviet Union and the United States helped eliminate this destabilizing class of missile, which in that time was armed with nuclear weapons and so could be used for destabilizing first strikes against capitals in Europe or in the Soviet Union. Fast forward, however, starting in 2008, Russia violated the INF Treaty by testing the 9M729 cruise missile, ground-launched intermediate-range cruise missile, that likely has a range of around 2,500 kilometers. Since then, the U.S. protested along with its NATO allies. Russia ignored it and built more than 100 of these missiles and has also been developing other ground-launched intermediate-range missiles. So the decision to leave because of Russia, I think, is sound. Another consideration was that China, which was never party to the bilateral treaty and then repeatedly declined to join it over the years, built, starting in the 1990s, a massive intermediate-range missile force. It now has thousands of conventionally armed and nuclear-armed missiles in this range, able to target U.S. ships at sea and also bases ashore, not only throughout the territory of U.S. allies in Asia, but also even to significant ranges far out at sea and then out to U.S. territory in Alaska, Guam, and the Northern Marianas. So because of these two factors, both the Russian violations of the treaty and the changing strategic environment and what China presents, I think it was a sound decision.
Of course, we have to point out that those weapons also have area denial as well as precision strike capabilities, which makes them all the more vexing. What are some of the key takeaways from the report?
We examined sort of the history of the INF Treaty, and we found that it was a good treaty, but as I mentioned earlier, that the strategic environment has changed and it makes sense for the U.S. to leave the treaty for both operational reasons and strategic ones. And then we also found that there are a number of options available to the United States in the near term and midterm to pursue that could provide this intermediate range capability to address some operational gaps.
And Adam, let me ask you, right? This part of this is a significant numbers game. As Tim just pointed out, we've got I was going to say the Soviets. The Russians and the Chinese have thousands of these weapons. China has been investing very, very heavily on the capability, starting in 1996, to keep 2 U.S. aircraft carriers from coming back into the Taiwan Strait ever again. How long will it take the United States and its allies to basically catch up from what appears to be a rather vast numeric disadvantage?
So in some sense, Vago, it's a lot of a funding issue and a political will issue. Right now, many of the INF systems that were in the President's FY 2020 budget request were left unfunded by the House versions of the Defense Authorization and Appropriations Acts. And the only items which are not which were left funded are a long-range cannon, which cannot hit anything Chinese-related from U.S. territory, or the precision strike missile, which is theoretically only up to 500 kilometers. If the United States and its allies ever truly want to catch up with the simple mass that the Chinese can bring to bear, we need a mix of high and low capabilities. The cost of hitting Chinese territory from places like Guam, that's 3,000, 4,000 kilometers away. Those are very expensive missiles. What we need are basing access and political will from our allies to place the cheaper, shorter range missiles closer to Chinese territory. You're looking at 800, 1,000, 1,200 kilometers, I would say.
And talk to us about, and would like to get both of your senses on this, how we can quickly try to do this and how we can bring our allies to do this, because their buy-in is going to be very important. I know that, there are Japanese, I know that part of Chinese battle planning is to target, for example, sacred sites in Japan to get the Japanese people to, try to push the United States out of there and being like, hey, look, they're a liability for your long-term security. What are the types of systems we have to develop, and how do we get our allies aboard so that they are as willing and happy to have this deterrent capability on their soil as we want them?
Sure. In our study, we examined broadly 3 classes of ground-launched intermediate-range systems. The first are ballistic missiles, which are initially powered and then fly along a parabolic trajectory. The second were hypersonic boost glide systems, which are, again, initially powered but then fly along a non-parabolic trajectory. And then cruise missiles, which are mostly powered throughout the course of their flight. Each of these classes of missiles provides unique operational advantages and have different attributes. So cruise missiles, for instance, tend to be lower cost, can carry larger payloads, and are generally kinematically easier to intercept than ballistic or hypersonic missiles, which tend to be higher cost, can go faster speeds, but have smaller payloads. So a mix of these different types of systems can help address some of these gaps and would provide unique operational advantages. We found that some of those advantages tend to be responsiveness, so you could quickly strike targets, survivability, if those forces practice good passive and active defense measures, and then also an ability to support the rest of the operational force. So they can strike targets independently on their own, but probably even more importantly is going to be creating operational access for other sea and air-launched weapons and air forces to be able to conduct operations. As another example of cross-domain operations, for instance, ground-launched intermediate-range missiles can not only support operations like targeting forces on the ground or conducting attacks on enemy air defenses, but they could even do things like supporting space operations by being able to target enemy anti-satellite weapon sensors deep inside their territory in a prompt manner, which thus enables U.S. satellites to operate and provide communications and sensing support. To the latter half of your question on making this politically possible with some of our allies, that's been a concern that's been raised, whether U.S. allies would allow these classes of weapons onto their territory, and it's an important one. We think, however, that when you look at the other U.S. systems that have been fielded to some of Allied territory, it includes a broad number of strike systems capable of attacking enemy territory. So I think there's precedent for bringing in a new class of strike system onto their territory as well. Additionally, I think a mitigating measure the U.S. could take is to field sort of a mix of systems. Some longer range systems that could be based on U.S. territory, such as Guam or Alaska, that could strike some key targets, and then some shorter range systems that would need to be based on Allied territory. But that mix of systems could help ensure that the U.S. sort of hedges its approach moving forward.
Adam?
Yeah, I just want to echo that. This could be a lot of prompt strike systems based in Allied territory, yes, that breaks down the doors, and then leaves the way open for the mass of cheaper, shorter range systems that you can really bring to bear that can truly give U.S. sea and air-based systems the access they need. Ground-based systems on their own, by virtue of not being needed to be launched from an aircraft, not being needed to be launched from a large naval vessel, they do tend to be cheaper. You sacrifice mobility by being on perhaps a lot of small islands in the Japanese archipelago, but still, they do come with a lower cost.
And speaking about the cost, I mean, the money looks good now, but we have a debt deal in place that makes sure that the headache will be worse for this bender in a couple of years, and it's unlikely that defense will escape because, I mean, let's face it, we've been on a steady defense increase for a very long time, so it has been a boom. How much money would have to be invested on an annual basis to build the kind of stockpile we need that would give us the operational flexibility we need, but also serve as a deterrent for an adversary that may feel emboldened because that's seen as a gap in our capabilities?
Sure. So we didn't price out, full-on INF missile forces. We wanted to give policymakers as many options as possible. We gave them more than a dozen individual options that they could pursue. If you want to look at a Tomahawk ground-launched cruise missile force, several hundred ground-launched Tomahawks could be developed and fielded for perhaps $1.5 billion. For the same price, maybe even a little more, $2 to $2.5 billion, you could field a few dozen Pershing II style ballistic missiles. So ballistic missile forces, particularly longer range ones, come with a rather high price tag. The cruise missiles, shorter range systems, less so. You can bring a lot more mass to bear.
How important are hypersonics going to be in this? I know that we've got a crash program. Everybody's talking about hypersonics, but we were talking to Uzi Rubin, legendary missile defender, but also strategist with the Sadat Begin Center, who was also one of the fathers of the Arrow missile defense system, I should add. Was talking about, look, there's nothing new about hypersonics. Hypersonics, the Sangers wrote their paper in, he was very specific, August 1944, and there is no weapon that's been developed that doesn't have a counter to it. So he said, I don't look at hypersonics with any more terror than I look at any other weapon system. What's the right way to think about hypersonics, how to use them? And also some folks, I know Rand's done some work on this, about whether or not there should be ultimately a treaty preventing hypersonics. What's your thinking in the role of hypersonics in sort of the future battle space?
That's a great question, Vago. When you look at the original negotiation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF hypersonic boost glide missiles were not covered by that treaty. They only really focused on ground-launched cruise and ballistic missiles because they assumed that hypersonic systems that would be unpowered for more than half of their flight wouldn't be operationally achievable, at least within the foreseeable future. Technology has matured over the past few decades where now they are mature, they are being fielded by our adversaries, and the U.S. is considering fielding a number of those systems as well. They are not, however, a panacea, as sort of the colleagues you referenced pointed out. They do provide, I think, unique operational advantages because they fly through a certain part of the atmosphere profile that cruise missiles don't and ballistic missiles don't either. So it presents new sensor challenges and targeting challenges for our adversaries, and the U.S. should pursue this class of system, but we can't rely on them being a panacea to all problems, among other reasons, because all things considered, hypersonic boost glide systems tend to carry relatively small payloads as compared to cruise missiles or bombs or other delivery systems. So the U.S. needs to incorporate them as part of its kit. I think it's important for us to improve funding into hypersonic boost glide systems and other strike systems, but it's not the only area the U.S. should focus on moving forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that sentiment in terms of hypersonic systems can give a very good prompt early strike capability that can break down the door, and that opens up avenues for other forces, INF and non-INF compliant, to do the real work, to bring the real firepower to bear.
Do you think that at some point that great powers will decide, hey, look, this is a capability that we should exempt, or is that going to go the way, unfortunately, almost every even chemical weapons, right? We've done everything we can to prevent people from using chemical weapons, and they've still used chemical weapons at the end of the day. Do you think that that's something that's going to be ultimately, there will be a groundswell to control or not? Again, in part because they're being regarded as terror weapons that maybe the reality is a little bit different than their perception.
That's a good question. I think hypersonic weapons in general, or very fast weapons, do introduce new political challenges in terms of strategic stability and managing escalation. At the same time, I think that at least in the coming decade, it's going to be difficult to control their proliferation, especially among the US, Russia, and China, especially as hypersonic weapons and ballistic missiles, and then air-launched hypersonic weapons of various kinds are sort of blending in terms of categories. So it's going to be, I think, difficult to force the Chinese or Russians, in particular the Chinese, who have a strong lead in this area, to abide and sort of commit themselves to a treaty that would restrict their capability. I think as the capability matures and as hypersonic weapons gain even greater ranges beyond these intermediate ranges and now are mated to intercontinental strike systems, there may be a push in a potential future treaty a decade or two in the future to try to restrict, I think, the number of them or the types of them. But for now, I think it's an area where, if nothing else, the U.S. needs to invest and field more of these systems so that it can have in the future a sound negotiating position.
And Adam, last word?
Sure. Just that in terms of strategic systems, hypersonic weapons perhaps are not nearly as destabilizing. In terms of theater systems where you're talking minutes from firing to impact, that could be a more destabilizing function. But I echo Tim here. We're a long way away from any sort of arms control agreement on these sorts of things. We're likely to see an arms race of some sort in the future and have already been seeing an arms race.
Adam Lemon, Tim Walton of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Check out their report, Leveling the Playing Field, Reintroducing U.S. Theater-Range Missiles in a Post-INF World, available on the CSBA website. Guys, pleasure as always to be here. Love the backdrop, and thanks very much for all your time.
Thank you, Vago.
Thanks for having us, Vago. Thanks.